What are the risks of buying a penthouse apartment in New York City? We'll demystify this topic in the following video. I'm Nick at Houseit. Visit houseit.com to save money when buying, selling, or renting real estate in New York City, Long Island, the Hudson Valley, or South Florida. So let's get started. So, what are the risks of buying a penthouse apartment in New York City? Well, the first risk is that of possibly overpaying. Penthouse apartments typically command a substantial premium for many reasons, including the fact that you have superior light views and exposure, private outdoor space, and so forth. Now, that being said, the premium associated with these benefits sometimes can be inflated. You might notice on occasion that a penthouse apartment may not even have an accurate square footage figure on the listing for obvious reasons, because of the fact that the true price per square foot would appear to be far out of line, of course, with units in the building. That comes as no surprise, but possibly considerably more money than other penthouse apartments in the area. So please make sure that you are actually getting a good deal. Having a good buyer's agent at your side can be very helpful in this regard. And of course, here at Houseit, we can help you save money on your purchase while assisting you in the capacity of a buyer's agent through our Houseit Buyer Closing Credit service. Of course, depending on your budget, the savings we offer can be substantial, but on a typical, say, $5 million penthouse purchase here in New York City, our clients do receive a closing credit of, in some cases, up to $100,000, or in many cases, more than $100,000 on a typical $5 million budget. The closing gift will be even higher, of course, as the budget goes further north. So please do not hesitate to reach out if we can be of assistance. You can visit houseit.com to learn more. Now, what is the next risk associated with buying a penthouse? Well, in our opinion, one of the most important things to keep in mind when buying a penthouse is the risk of leaks. Certainly, being on the top floor has its share of benefits, but of course that also means that you are the first point of entry and port of call, so to speak, for water, moisture, and other sorts of hazards that come in from the roof. Now, of course, in most cases, a typical penthouse won't have any egregious increase in the risk. Of course, you'll have to potentially be subjected to a roof repair from time to time, people walking on the roof, doing mechanical repairs and so forth, trying to access the elevator room, people repairing their HVAC. So that's not necessarily a problem, and the maintenance is usually routine. The problem is when there is a leak in the roof and it cannot actually be detected in terms of where it's coming from. In these types of scenarios, the roof might have to be completely ripped down to the studs, potentially redone, or they could put a layer on top of it. And in some cases, though, unfortunately, even the roof itself is not the problem. It could actually be the facade and what they call the parapet, which is basically that topmost layer of brick right where it abuts the actual roof membrane. And we've actually seen in cases like the one we're discussing, where the actual leak is coming from the facade. In this case, it actually required half of the top floor to literally be sliced off the building, and they had to actually rebuild half of the facade on the top floor, and obviously by extension rebuild the roof and the membrane and so forth. So you do have a remote risk of some catastrophic issue occurring with the roof that literally requires you to have to move out of your apartment and for half of your apartment to be sliced and for them to have to redo it. But it's a remote risk. But more practically speaking, what will happen with regard to leaks is that, from time to time, water may enter. The source of the leak will be addressed. It won't repeat itself, but then you'll have to make repairs within your unit. Of course, like the ceiling, the walls might have moisture damage. You have to bring drywall people in and so forth. So it can just be annoying as far as, your quality of life is concerned. Another risk with buying a penthouse apartment is the fact that you may be paying very high common charges and property taxes in the case of a condo. Now, how much you actually pay depends on, in the case of a condo, the percentage of common interests assigned to your apartment. In the case of a co-op, it would depend on the number of shares assigned to your unit. But in either case, the methodology for assigning this ownership interest to your particular apartment is quite subjective, and depending on the building, you could have a really egregiously high percentage of the building's common elements, and that will result in you having a very high share of the monthly operating expenses assigned to the building, and that manifests itself in having egregiously high common charges. So it's just something to keep in mind. Obviously, if you're buying a penthouse, you have some degree of comfort in terms of fairly high operating costs for your residents, But nevertheless, just be on the lookout for egregious examples where you, as an individual unit owner, are paying a disproportionately large share of the overall upkeep costs of the building. By extension, another risk with buying a penthouse apartment is that you will have huge assessments. Now, this is related to the previous item we discussed because the size of any assessment does depend on your fractional percentage ownership in the building as a whole. So depending on the offering plan of your building and how that weighting was calculated originally, you can face a fairly large assessment or perhaps something more reasonable, but it all depends on the building. And as a result, doing buyer due diligence on the size of your building's percentage common elements, say in the case of a condo, is very important before you pull the trigger. Another risk of buying a penthouse apartment is the fact that it might be hard to sell. Penthouse apartments are expensive, and by definition, they have less liquidity. There's a much more laborious process associated with selling them. You just simply have to look at the average days on the market in New York City. Usually is around 90 to 100-ish days for a typical apartment. Typical apartment in New York City, priced around $1 million. And as that price point goes up, certainly once you go above $5 million, the average days on market blows out to something like 6 months or even longer. Again, it's not a huge concern if you're buying a penthouse because you do have that degree of comfort in terms of allocating assets to this purchase. But just keep that in mind. If at any point you need to sell and you want to have that ease of liquidity in terms of selling, it's going to be a little bit slower of a process on average for a penthouse apartment. Now, we'll leave you with one more key risk of buying a penthouse in New York City, and this is a particularly important one to keep in mind. It is the risk of your view, your light, and your exposure being obstructed by future construction. Now, this risk is actually a risk for all apartments in the city, regardless of whether or not they're a penthouse. But the reason why we emphasize it in this particular video as it relates to penthouses is because of the fact that you're usually paying a pretty considerable premium to have the privilege of living in a penthouse. You're at the top of the building, so they're really charging you for having the best views, light, and exposure in the building. As a result, if something goes up across the street, or if your apartment has a lot of lot line windows and there's neighboring construction, the loss of your view, your light, and your exposure could have a disproportionate impact on the value of your investment. So it is just something to keep in mind. Now, if you are at the point where you're thinking of pulling the trigger, there are ways to assess the risk. There will never be absolute certainty with respect to development in neighboring lots and adjacent buildings and so forth, but there is one way to get a pretty good read on this situation, and that's through ordering what's called a sightline report. Many title companies do offer this service where they basically look at neighboring lots around your apartment and they assess based on the zoning and the existing construction what sort of unused development rights may exist and how those may potentially impact your view over time as there is additional development. So we hope you found this video to be helpful. Please remember that we can help you save money here at Houseit. Learn how by visiting houseit.com. We'd love to also stay in touch. More generally, we can help you sell and rent in addition to buy in New York City, Long Island, the Hudson Valley, as well as South Florida. So give us a call, 888-494-8258, or send an email, team@houseit.com, to get in touch. You can also leave a comment below this video, and we look forward to connecting with you. I'm Nick at Houseit, and we'll see you on the next video.